Okay, welcome back to Church History 401, Chapter 18, Infallibility and Inerrancy. Excellent. Okay, we're going to have a little bit of a social gospel overview. We're going to explore the continued irrelevantness of the church, the loss of faith in gospel theology, but a refusal to approach modernity like that, and instead an infallible Pope, an inerrant Bible. And good news, just continuing to be good news, but just elsewhere. Okay. Look at me advertising the mug. The pace of change was bewildering, and both Knoll and Threlfall Holmes in their book, they both quote this pessimistic poem from Arnold's Dover Beach poem. The sea of faith was once too at the full and round earth's shore, but now I only hear its melancholy long withdrawing roar. Well, that's a bit sad and disappointing. So let's look at some good stuff. Let's see Charles Spurgeon. Let's see the Salvation Army as they bring dignity to the ordinary working class, and they see hearts changed, and teetotalism and the temperance movement. And we see a rise of social action, the total redemption of man, so to speak, of humankind, not just the salvation of souls. When people say we should think more of the soul and less of the body, my answer is that the same God who made the soul made the body also. I maintain that God is worshipped not only by the spiritual but by the material creation. Our bodies, the temples of the Holy Ghost, ought not to be corrupted by preventable diseases, degraded by avoidable filth, and disabled for his service by unnecessary suffering. Good for Shaftesbury. Well done, Shaftesbury. Thank you for that. In saying that. So we see the rise of mission halls and clothing societies, relief stations, soup kitchens, that sort of thing. But in all of this, we see the beginning spin and dizziness of modernity. And what should we do about it? One idea is we adjust the faith to accommodate what's going on. We already saw how Kant split the private and the public. And Kierkegaard proceeded to emphasize it's more about the life that you live than the doctrine that you hold. Schleiermacher goes for more of a God consciousness approach. There's a couple of quotes here on page 13 of 20 in section 18. Religion is essentially an intuition, a feeling. Religion is the miracle of direct relationship with the infinite. So they were Schleiermacher trying to speak into the time. But the alternative approach is don't adjust, be who you are. So we have Pope Pius the Ninth, and the Pope does some nice things for Mary. Everybody loves Mary already. So by the Pope doing what he does, he proclaims the dogma of the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin Mary. He does that in 1854, which said that she was purified of original sin before her birth. Now, what it's doing there is really pushing against an open door, if you like. There's already a lot of love for Mary, and so by the Pope saying, "Yay, Mary," everyone goes, "Oh, what a nice guy that Pope is." So it's really just scoring points for the Pope rather than especially an extra elevation of Mary. So don't worry about it too much in that regard. And the Pope comes out with a list of books he does not want you to read. The Syllabus of Errors, 1864. I bet that list sold well. And if ever you've been involved in the cry to call out to protest against a particular book or a film, you know as a Christian that is just clickbait. That's all it is. And it's trying to get you to promote that book or film by saying, Christians say this is horrible and we shouldn't be. You know that just doing that will in itself cause. Never mind. We may have learned from history. So we come to the First Vatican Council, 1869 to 70, and it's at this that papal infallibility is declared. Now there's a chunk here that sort of explains that, from Noel's Turning Points, page 257. So you need to understand that when the Pope goes, "Ooh, it's Saturday, let's have pizza," he's not being infallible when he says that. "Ooh, pass the salt," that's not necessarily an infallible statement. Okay, it's only infallible under certain quite tight conditions, and here we have it. And I think that the only time he's ever used the "I'm infallible" card has been in the 1960s, what's called the doctrine of the Assumption of Mary. This is the idea that Mary's body, after her death, was assumed into heaven. Ascension, really. A post-death ascension for Mary. So, there you are. That's the Pope pushing for infallibility. It's a way of bringing a solidity to a turbulent time. So the evangelicals, they do the same but different. They look at the Bible and they go, that is infallible, that is inerrant. And so in 1909 we have, if you like it, it's taking the scientific method and applying it to the Bible and saying, you like your science? Science is where you find your certainty? Well, we've got a textbook, and in our textbook this is where we find the solid ground of our faith. And so this is where you get the fundamentals. It's a real shame about how that word has changed, but there you are. But at this point, fundamentals meaning the core essential beliefs to do with the Christian faith. And here are the list of 5. The inerrancy of the Bible, the deity of Christ, the virgin birth, substitutionary atonement, and the bodily second coming of Christ. Interesting. Second coming of Christ. I would have put the physical resurrection down there. I wonder. Virgin birth. Interesting that's part of the fundamentals 5. In 1910 we have a gathering in Edinburgh of missionaries, and they discuss 8 subjects. You've got them listed here, complete with some statistics about how well that is doing. We saw earlier the Roman Catholics doing rather well in their mission. Of course, as some of that mission brings with it warfare, because it's not just Xavier and Ricci doing quiet mission in places. It's also quite bold and in-your-face missions, the conquest of Mexico and Peru, so that it becomes hard, as Miranda Threlfall-Holmes says, hard to disentangle the work of evangelism from the brutality of conquest. Now, Protestant mission, here we find an aspect of foreign policy where mission and foreign policy are intertwined. So similar in that sense, if you like, to the Catholic Spanish approach to things. Here we find the Book of Common Prayer adds an extra service to it, the baptism for those of riper years. Now this is useful for the purposes of baptizing natives on our plantations and other converts to the faith. So this is to be used by missionaries as they go out. We need to talk slavery, and there's a little bit here in my notes, and it would be really just too trite to do much justice to it here. But one of the difficult questions that the missionaries have as they go to the plantations to bring the gospel is that these slave owners want to know whether or not you think that if a slave becomes a Christian, should that Christian slave be treated differently to the non-Christian slave? So should the Christian slave be nearer to the master in terms of how kind you are, in terms of accommodation, or can we leave the Christian slave with the non-Christian slave and treat them both the same? Just work with the repugnance of what's being discussed here, and the outcome. Because if the owners were against the idea of treating the Christian slave differently, and so in order for you to get access to preach the gospel, you needed to agree to that concept. Okay, fine, don't treat them any differently, but let me still tell them about the good news of Jesus. Gosh, that must have been a tremendously awkward and difficult place to have found themselves in. One of the problems I think that the owners found is that when slaves became Christians, they freshly discovered their dignity, and they freshly discovered a desire for freedom. So, for example, the slave revolts in Jamaica in 1381, they were led by Jamaican Baptists. Good on you, well done. But well, we've touched on Wilberforce, and it's worth just mentioning John Newton, slave trader, who converted, became an Anglican, and wrote Amazing Grace. Now, in all this missionary zeal, you've got different missionary societies growing up. SPCK would be a nice, easy example of that, and you may be familiar with other parachurch organisations. But as they do their missionary work, they come across a couple of problems, like cannibalism, like polygamy, and now you've got to think through and go, what is Christian and what is Western? And how do we help you work out your own indigenous way of being Christian with who you are, where you are with this gospel? That becomes something that in a course 604, Church History in Focus 604, we look at later if you're up for that. Now, the bishoprics are established in India, and we see the Baptist shoemaker William Carey, and we come across David Livingstone, I presume, of the London Missionary Society. Interesting that as he is bringing his gospel as well as his trade, getting them to grow cotton, a part of his agenda is also to challenge the slave trade that's going off in the other direction. And so he comes to challenge the East African slave trade run by Arabs and Swahili as a way of breaking that. And so he offers cotton as an alternative commerce to that. Samuel Crowther is to be celebrated and much rejoiced. Here we have somebody born a Yoruba, captured as a slave at 15, but his ship is intercepted and he ends up at Sierra Leone. He becomes a Christian. He ends up coming to England to be ordained. He returns to his people in Nigeria. He runs an all-African staff working over hundreds of miles. He becomes a bishop in 1864. Wouldn't it be great if we could stop the story there? That would be really great. But unfortunately what we find is a new batch of white missionaries come along, and they would not accept him. And so they sent him off on a particularly dangerous long mission, and that's where he died. But I'd like to end this session just by looking at Colenso, a heretic bishop in South Africa, missionary to the Zulus, and he wanted to see toleration for polygamy. He found it very difficult to be a missionary in a setting where polygamy was quite normal, but the church statement from 1888, the Lambeth Conference, their conclusion on polygamy was, first get rid of the others, you can keep one wife, and then you can get baptized. And I'd just like to point out that the understanding of that changed in 1988, 100 years later, where the message is first get baptized and then we'll talk about the wives later. Part of our interesting discussion in General Synod about marriage and marriage laws has been the degree to which we can, as a church, change our view and our attitudes on marriage and how it fits within the gospel of grace. And it would seem that between 1888 and 1988 we have changed our views regarding marriage, at least over in the area of polygamy. So I'll just let that hang there as an interesting conundrum. We're moving into the 20th century, so I want to do a very quick plug here for a bunch of different books. If you find yourself curious about more church history, particularly in the 20th century area, Justo Gonzalez, he's written two very good books. This one is the second one, Reformation to the Present Day, and it's very readable. I do commend it. Modern church history goes from the English Civil War onwards, and I actually found it quite hard. read in parts. Little trouble there trying to work out what the woods and the trees were trying to do. Moira Aston would give this book a plug, partly because it's thin and because it's How the Church Has Got to Be the Way They Are by Gavin White. And that's a very good look at the, well, particularly the 18th century, and it builds up what these last couple of lectures have been exploring, and it builds us up nicely to the 20th century. This is the best book on church history in the 20th century, curiously called Christianity in the 20th Century. Great title for a book like that. And it's by Brian Stanley, and it's a tough read, but it's really good. It's worth the sweat. Of course, it's only really good if you're actually writing an essay that's relevant to it. It is the set text, by the way, for 604, second half of the 604 course, if you find yourself doing it. So if you can, treat yourself to this book, alright, because this book's really fun. And what it does is on each page, it gives you a one-page, a little bit of, you can see it's a bedtime children's storybook, it's brilliant. And it gives you there's Martin Luther, there's Hannah More, and it just takes you through some people, Rosa Parks, that you should be knowing something about. Robert Raikes, I think we made mention of earlier. Selina, Countess of Huntingdon, I'm sure we touched on her. Certainly she's in the notes if she's not on the visual version. So that's just a really fun book, and I commend it to you for giving very small little teaser tasters over things. I will see you shortly for chapter 19.